So when we see tragedies like this, from your seat, from your expert seat, what goes through your head?
If this was the first, second, third, fourth, fifth tragedy that we were talking about, my response would be different. But it seems like we go through this for the last 2 decades on a regular basis. So I have a very strong push and feeling that our country needs to respond differently. We need to move to a prevention approach here. And for example, California has actual data on almost every high school on how many kids bring weapons, how many kids were threatened by weapons, how many kids see weapons, and they really don't use it at the school level. And that would be the rumbling before the storm. I think that would be a great way to prevent and also educate the peer group, which seems to know over 20%, over 90% of schools in California have over 20% of students who actually have seen a weapon on campus and know who it is. So if we can unleash that, we could maybe prevent some of these, more of these events and hear less of them in the news and just respond to the aftermath of the shootings.
That's a good point. Maybe this is not fair to say, but it seems like every time something like this happens, we don't really have a lot of data that we're talking about. A lot of people tend to be responding more emotionally and they pick a side, whether it's on gun control or mental health issues, but it seems like we're kind of going in circles, maybe because we don't have the data that we need.
We do have it. The state is just not using it. The state has been collecting it for the last at least 20 years. They ask almost every high school kid every other year, every year, have you brought a gun to school? Have you brought a knife to school? They ask kids, have you been threatened on campus? They ask, have you seen? And they have that data per every school. There could be very easily made an algorithm that actually shows which schools are off the charts. And we've looked at some of this data statewide and written about it. And that could very easily be done so that those schools that have high trigger concerns, the rumbling before the storm, resources could be brought there, education could be given to the teachers and the students, parents could be educated, and we could maybe prevent some of these because it looks like the peer group really knows a lot about what's going on, and we're not able to access them because we're only asking them immediately after events.
Right. And so in the meantime, what is happening to these kids, whether they're in it, whether they're in one of these situations, or they're on the sidelines wondering when it's going to happen to them?
That's right. And we're looking nationwide right now. All the polls, the big difference between 5 years ago and now, the kids are actually ranking being shot in their own school as one of their greatest anxiety and concerns. This is almost nationwide. And in California, it's the number one educational issue in all the polls for education is having school shootings. So it's not only those who have been in the shooting itself, it's impacted our entire culture in the last 5 years. And that makes it even more urgent that we use common sense, educational, public health approaches to actually reduce the violence. We've done it with other very serious uh, issues like AIDS, like substance use. And when we put our minds to it, we actually get big reductions. We haven't done that with this issue.
So being that you're a local professor, curious if you know anything specifically about Saugus High School or the schools in that district, just to help us sort of contextualize what happened yesterday.
Well, I was born and raised in the San Fernando Valley, which is not too far away. But I don't know personally anybody in that school or those principals or those kids. I do know that the story that's being told there is such a common one that we've heard after all these shootings, and in that sense, the reaction, the response is pretty similar to what we've heard in the last 3 or 4 years, including all these heroes that are jumping in. I would prefer that we move our conversation as a country to actually finding those heroes long, long, long before there's a threat in the school so that kids know that they're actually saving their friends' lives um, by actually letting people know that there's even a weapon on campus and that the authorities and the teachers and schools respond in a caring way where they could actually provide mental health supports, social supports. We could do that. So I don't know specifically about this school, but I have a strong sense that schools like it, and there are many like it across the country, could actually use some prevention right now and not just more officers, guns, and threat assessments. That won't get us out of this situation in the long run.
Right, and you are touching on this throughout these interview, but what kind of conversations do you hear after this sort of a tragedy, and do you think people are talking about the wrong things?
I think so. It immediately moves to the Second Amendment gun debate. And I don't think anybody is arguing in the country that high schoolers should be carrying guns. So, again, if we have data that shows that they're carrying guns and knives and kids are feeling uncomfortable, and so imagine there's no shooting, but a child goes to an AP class or to a math class and knows there's a weapon on campus and somebody's been threatened by it in the last year, 2, 3, 4 times, that affects your daily life, how you wake up in the morning, what you think, how you respond. And we haven't really talked about that. We haven't talked about how all these drills are impacting all the kids across the country emotionally, psychologically, how they feel about our country. And that conversation needs to start happening because we're creating a society which is paranoid, and maybe rightfully so, because we're not really addressing the issue that needs to be talked about. And that is that we need caring, supportive, loving schools. We know that in communities, when you put a tank or a police officer in every corner, that doesn't necessarily make the neighborhood safer. But when the neighbors come out and they work together and they know each other and they have friendships, that's actually the biggest crime deterrent we have. And the same goes for schools and for our society. And we somehow have gotten sidetracked about talking about that.
Right, and it sounds like what you're saying is we need a whole culture shift on many levels. So that looks like it's going to be, a long-term solution. And in the meantime, I think this is going to have a long-term impact on all the students and their families that are going through this or watching this. Professor, thank you so much for your insight.